Right.
All right.
Okay. Good morning, everyone in Brazil, and good evening, professors. I am Camila Galvão, a Brazilian lawyer, researcher of AI ethics, and the vice president of AIRES, PUCRS Porto Alegre in Brazil. I declare open another panel of the 7th International Colloquium on Ethics, Bioethics, and AI ethics. Today, we have the honor of hosting presentations from Professor Zhao, Professor Xudong, and Professor Dattesh Parulekar. Shall we start it? I will now give the floor to our first speaker this morning, Professor Zhao from Kobe University, who will be discussing Alan Turing's analysis of computability. Professor, you have 45 minutes for your presentation, and I will indicate with a raised hand on Zoom when there are 5 minutes remaining, okay? I wish you a great presentation, and the online floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me share the screen first. Okay. So is this okay with the screen sharing? Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction. And I would like to thank Professor Nathan for inviting me to give this talk, and really thank him for having a very this rich program and conference. So I myself is not working on ethics. So my research area is about the history and philosophy of logic and computation. So in particular, I worked on the works of Alan Turing. So Turing's work on the machine intelligence are well known. And nowadays, we're still talking about the Turing test. But his works on the machine intelligence are arguably influenced by his earlier work on the foundations of mathematics. And in particular, his 1936 works on the analysis of computability. So I think it might be helpful today if I just talk about his analysis of computability, and perhaps in a sort of introductory way. But if you are interested in any aspect of this talk, and please just feel free to ask. So there are three elements that I want to cover in today's presentation. So the first, I want to talk about the origins of Turing's analysis of computability. So why he provided analysis of computability. And then I want to give you an outline of Turing's analysis of computability, just in case some of you are not familiar with it. And then finally, I want to touch on the issue of the interpretations of his analysis of computability, which I think is still a controversial issue now. Okay, so just let's go back from 1931 when Turing entered Cambridge, the King's College, Cambridge, as an undergraduate doing mathematics. So he finished his bachelor degree in 1934, and in 1935 he took a course by the topologist Max Newman on the foundations of mathematics. So in 1936, he published a paper called Uncomputable Numbers with an application to the insurance problem. The insurance problem is regarded as one of the leading problems of the mathematical logic in the early 20th century. So this is a claim given by Frank Ramsey, who was also a very important logician in the early 20th century, although died at a very young age. The conclusion that Turing achieved in that paper, which is a negative answer to the insurance problem, is that there can be no general process for determining whether a given formula of the functional calculus K is provable. So the basic idea is that So logicians are interested in proving formulas and give a proof for a formula, but some formulas are not provable. So if there can be a process or a mechanical procedure for determining whether a given formula is provable or not, so that would be great, because with this procedure, then we can distinguish provable formula and non-provable formula, and we don't want to waste our time on the non-provable formula. But then Turing established that there can be no general process for determining whether a given formula is provable or not. So Turing knew this problem, as I mentioned, from Max Newman's course on the foundations of mathematics in earlier 1935. So Newman opened this course from 1934. Newman, in the obituary of Turing, said that it was in 1935 that Turing first began to work in mathematical logic, and almost immediately started on the investigation that was to lead to his best-known results on computable numbers and the Turing machine. So it is from Newman's course that Turing knew the insurance problem and began to work on the insurance problem. And a few months later, in the summer of 1935, he got the main idea of that paper. So this is the recollection from Robin Gandy, who was Turing's student and Turing's friend, said that Turing taught me that the main idea of the paper came to him when he was lying in Grantchester Meadows in the summer of 1935. The main idea might have either been his analysis of computation or his realization that there was a universal machine and so a diagonal argument to prove unsolvability. So it's a little bit on pity that Gandy was not certain about which main idea or which idea that Turing has regarded as main idea was in the summer of 1935. But certainly in the summer of 1935, that Turing had already conceived of the machine computation and also presumably a universal Turing machine. So Sarah Turing, who was Turing's mother, wrote a biography for her son, said that when Alan was assembling his thoughts on computable numbers, Mr. David Champignon, now Professor Champignon, spent a few days with us in the summer of 1935, and I recall the amused skepticism with which he discussed the possibility of constructing a machine such as Alan then investigated to demonstrate his mathematical argument. He mockingly maintained that to host it, a building the size of Albert Hall would be required. So in the summer of 1935, Turing has already thought about to use a notion of a machine to tackle the insurance problem, and may even have thought about to make the machine physical. And unfortunately, we don't know much about what happened in the fall of 1935 and in the winter of 1935 to 1936. So the next milestone that we know or documented evidence is in the April of 1936, where Turing finished a draft of uncomputable numbers. So this is what Turing wrote to his mother, Sarah, on the 4th of May, 1936. He wrote, I saw Mr. Newman for 5 days after I came up. He's very busy with other things just at present, and says he will not be able to give his whole attention to my theory for some weeks or so yet. However, he examined my notes for CI and approved it after some alternation. So on the sort of the middle of April 1936, that Turing handed to Newman a draft of uncomputable numbers and also a summary in French to Newman. So this the CI refers to a French journal. He summarized the paper on computable numbers in French with the help of his mother. And Newman was sort of very busy and can't really read the draft, but Newman read the summary and give some suggestions. So Turing then revised the paper for a week, for a month, and then in the May of 1936, he submitted this paper for publication. But it's interesting because almost on the same day that he submitted his paper to the proceedings of the London Mathematical Society, that he heard from Newman that American logician Arnold the Church has already resolved the insurance problem and already published the results in an academic journal. This is probably the voiced news that that any researchers want to hear. And Newman and Turing discovered immediately that Church and Turing's method are entirely different. So then Turing's paper should be published. So this is what Turing wrote to his mother on the 29th of May. And he said, meanwhile, a paper has appeared in America written by another church doing the same things in a different way. Mr. Newman and I have decided, however, that the method is sufficiently different to warrant the publication of my paper too. So with the help of Newman, that Turing's paper was published at the end of 1936. And then Turing went to Princeton to do a PhD with another church. So here is just a brief summary of the timeline of Turing's pathway towards his paper on computable numbers. So in the early 1935, that Turing knew the problem, the Shannon's problem, and began to work on it. And a few months later, in the summer of 1935, he got the main idea of that paper. And almost a year later, in April of 1936, that he had a draft ready and sent it to Newman. And in the May of 1936, he submitted the paper, the manuscript for publication. And towards the end of 1936, that the paper was already published. So that's the brief timeline. So Andrew Hodges, who wrote the very famous biography of Turing, gave I think a very fair comment towards Turing's towards Turing's pathway to uncomputable numbers. And Hodges said Turing had worked entirely on his own, not once discussing the construction of his machines with Newman. But of course, scholars are interested in analyzing the influence of Turing. So people are interested in not just Turing was genius and working by his own, but really trying to trace the source of his thoughts. And I myself doing some sort of work, this kind of work, although I'm not going to talk about it today. But one of the very interesting interpretations, I think, is given by philosopher Julie Floyd. And Floyd really published her ideas in many papers, and even nowadays. So so if you're interested in, you can check out her paper. But basically, Floyd was trying to build a connection between Turing and the very famous philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. And Floyd tries to argue that there was a mutual influence between Turing and Wittgenstein. So for the side of, so on the one side, there was an influence from Wittgenstein to Turing's paper on computable numbers. But then on the other side, there was an influence from Turing's paper on computable numbers to Wittgenstein's later thought. So here is a very typical quote from her 2017 paper. And she said, the period leading to uncomputable numbers has been a bit of a mystery to those analyzing Turing's intellectual development. Insofar, there is little direct evidence of how his activities as an undergraduate pointed towards this great work. Our thesis is that philosophical ideas around him at Cambridge influenced Turing significantly during his undergraduate years, and especially his discussions with Wittgenstein, who in turn was responding to a long-standing Cambridge tradition of common sense. So I'm not going to elaborate her ideas, but Wittgenstein was also in Cambridge while Turing was there. And also Wittgenstein was teaching several courses over the years that Turing was there. So the hypothesis was that, Turing was kind of knew Wittgenstein's work and was influenced by Wittgenstein's ideas, and then put some of Wittgenstein's ideas into the paper on computable numbers. So this is a very interesting hypothesis, although I think it's something that we still need more verification, because there's little evidence about Turing's acquaintance of Wittgenstein's ideas prior to the publication of Uncomputable Numbers. So I will just leave this about, but I think this is a very interesting hypothesis, and it should be a topic that people continue to think about and work on. Okay, so that's about the origins of his paper. So now I would like to give you an outline of Turing's analysis of computability. So what really is his analysis of computability? So I want to start from maybe a familiar notion of the Turing machine. So of course, on computable numbers, Turing just called it the computing machine. And the term Turing machine was called by Arnold Church in 1937. So basically, I mean, the Turing machine has the following elements. So first, it works on an unbounded tape, and the tape was divided into squares so that the machine can write symbols on the tape, on the square of the tape. And then the machine has what Turing called the M configurations, or the machine configurations. So nowadays, I mean, it's more common to call it the states of the machine, right? So it's normally the if-then statement. So for example, I mean, if an M configuration QA or A or state A could be if the machine observe symbol 0 on the square, then the machine, erase the symbol 0 and change it to 1, right? And then Turing used the term configurations. So configurations is a pair of the scan symbols and the M configurations. So the configuration really determines the behaviors of the machine. And then there are 5 basic operations of the machine in uncomputable numbers. And the first is write down a symbol, and then is erase a symbol, and move left 1 square, move right 1 square, and change its M configurations. So that's pretty intuitive. So here is just one simple example from uncomputable numbers. So Turing's paper on computable numbers is really accessible, I would say. I mean, because I mentioned just now that Turing's method and Church's method are entirely different. So you can get a sense of this by really finding out their 2 papers, and if you don't know much about mathematical logic, then you probably find Church's paper just incomprehensible to you. But even if you don't know much about mathematical logic, you can find Turing's paper easy to follow at least initially. So here is one example of the Turing machine. So an alternate Turing machine began to work on a blank tape. So we assume that the initial state is the or the initial M configuration is B, right? So the machine is in state B, and then it's of course observe no symbol because there's nothing on the tape initially. So then the machine just prints 0. P0 means print 0 on the scanned square, and then move right 1 square, right? And then change its M configuration to C. So in the state C, again, the machine observes no symbol, and then it moves right 1 square, and then change its M configuration to E. And in E square, that there's no square on the tape, on the observed square, and then it prints 1, and then move right 1 square, and change its M configuration to F. And in F, there's nothing on the observed square, and then it move right 1 square right, and then changes M configuration to B. So you can see that this kind of going back, and then the machine can continue, move on, and you might already figure out this machine will print 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, blah blah indefinitely, right? So this is just one example, the actual example that Turing used. So you can understand it even if you don't know much about mathematical logic. So it's pretty accessible, I think. But also, Turing instead not only talking about there are different machines that compute different sequences, but also there's a universal machine. There's a machine that can imitate any Turing machine. So Turing's 1936 paper contained a genius invention of a universal computing machine. As he said, it is possible to invent a single machine which can be used to compute any computable sequence. So in other words, this universal machine can imitate any computing machine when properly instructed. But of course, the detailed, the detailed way of this construction of this universal machine is pretty complex. But the idea is pretty simple in the sense that you somehow just encode each particular Turing machine onto the tape of the universal machine, and the universal machine reads the coding of that particular machine and then imitate it. So this novel idea of a universal machine pioneers the fundamental logical principles of the modern computing. So because now we're using computers or your smartphone, and our computer or phone just stores different programs into the same storage, right? So just if you want to use Zoom, you just click the Zoom app. If you want to use Gmail, you just click Gmail app. So you store different programs onto the same storage. So this is idea of the, which people call the store program concept, which originated as in Turing's way of building the universal machine, pioneered the fundamental logical principles of the modern computer. And it is in this sense that, you would see that claims that Turing is the father of the modern computer. But of course, I mean, this is there is a controversial issue, and there is a debate about, whether the development of the modern computer was actually influenced by Turing. I mean, I myself think it's actually influenced by Turing, but I want to be, clear that there is a debate about this. So then Turing, give us some definition, like the computable numbers. Right? He said a number is computable if its decimal can be written down by a machine. Right? So the sequence 0, 1, 0, 1 definitely is computable because there is a machine there's a Turing machine that can compute it. But then he said, although the class of computable numbers is so great and in many ways similar to the class of real numbers, it is nevertheless innumerable. So innumerable is kind of a technical term in mathematical logic, which basically means that there is a one-on-one correspondence between the set of numbers that you are working on with the natural number. So and Turing's way of proving this is somehow is somehow easy to follow. So this is the the machine that we have encountered. And firstly, he converts this machine table to a standard form. So for example, we just used like Q1 to represent, the first state, and then X0 to represent maybe, a no symbol, and X1 to represent print 0, and R to represent R, and Q2 to represent the second state. And similarly, you can just use this way to convert machine table to its standard form. So after that, Turing converts the standard form of the machine to a standard description. So the standard description is also, just a simple substitution. So for example, we use DA to represent Q1, and we use DAA to represent Q2, right? DAAA to represent Q3, so on and so on. And D to represent S0, and DC to represent S1, and DCC to represent S2, and DCCC to represent S3. Well, there's no S3, I guess. But R to represent R, and DAA to represent Q2. So in this way, there's a pretty mechanical way to substitute each alphabet in the standard form to a standard description. So after that, Turing want to substitute the standard, convert the standard description to the description number. So, I mean, it's of course very long. I mean, it's kind of very difficult to write this number, but the idea is pretty simple, right? So you just use a number to substitute D, a number to substitute A, a number to substitute C, right? A number to substitute R, right? So in this way, that each Turing machine can be converted into a description number. Well, in other words, an integer, right? So this is an integer, of course, very long, and perhaps we will never encounter this integer in our life, but it's an integer, right? So, and each Turing machine, by doing this way, can be converted to an integer. And clearly, not all integer can be converted back to a Turing machine, right? So like integer 1 is not a Turing machine. So in this way, that we know that the description number or the set of Turing machine is really a subset of the integers, right? So it's so then it is enumerable in some sense. We can have a way to enumerate the Turing machine. So, which means that because we know from Cantor's diagonal argument that the real numbers are not enumerable. So there's no one correspondence between the real numbers to the integers. So then, which entails that the Turing machine or the computable numbers are enumerable, although very large, but there must be numbers, real numbers, that are not computable. So the set of computable numbers is not equivalent to the set of real numbers. So which means that there are uncomputable numbers, which means that there are the limitation of the Turing machine. There are numbers that no Turing machine can compute, right? So the Turing machine has computational limitations. So, of course, in Shannon's problem, because so far we just showed that there are limitations of the Turing machine, but the Shannon's problem says there can be no general process for determining whether a given formula of the functional calculus is provable. So it didn't say that there can be no Turing machine, right? So, so Turing must have something to say about the Turing machine is somehow equivalent in the computational power to our intuitive notion of the general process. So this is, what's now called the Turing thesis. So, which Turing said the computable numbers include all numbers which would naturally be regarded as computable. So with the Turing thesis, Turing was able to apply the limited results of his computing machines, the formal analysis of computability, to the informal analysis of computability. So as a consequence, Turing demonstrated that the Shannon's problem is not solvable. So, this is a summary of the structure of uncomputable number. So first, Turing gave a very well-defined mathematical notion of a Turing machine, and then proved that there are limitations of the machine computability. And then with the Turing thesis, he claimed that the machine computability, the formal analysis of computability, is, in the computational sense, is equivalent to our intuitive notion of computability. And then Turing, so then the limited results in the machine computability can be transformed to the intuitive notion of computability, and therefore to show that the Shannon's problem is not solvable. Okay, so, but that's, that's a Turing machine, but that's not Turing's analysis of computability, which I am going to, clarify now. So Robin Gandy again saying, so Turing's analysis makes no reference whatsoever to computing machines. So Turing machines appear as a result, as a codification of his analysis of calculation by humans. So similarly, historians of very influential historians of philosopher Wilfred Zheng said, so Turing's analysis is neither concerned with machine computations nor with the general human mental process. Rather, it is human mechanical computability that is being analyzed. So, so although I talk a lot about the Turing machine, just a moment before, but it's not really his analysis. So his analysis, or philosophical analysis, if you want, comes from his analysis of the human computer. And in particular, he analyzes some conditions that a human computer must satisfy when he or she is computing a number. So here, but first, before showing those conditions, I want to point out the exact place where his analysis of computability occurs in uncomputable numbers. So here is just the structure that we just saw now, and well, actually, his analysis of his computability or his analysis of the human computer occurs in his justification for the Church-Turing thesis. And he offered 3 justifications. So the first is, or the type C, is to give a lot of examples, right? So I give you a lot of examples, which means, it's maybe correct, intuitively correct, because I can give you, a lot of examples. But the second type of argument is to have equivalent proofs. So, that there may be different formalism of computability, and I prove that they're all equivalent. So, which give you more confidence for this thesis. But the type A argument is really unique for Turing. It's a direct appeal to intuition. And it is in this type A argument that Turing gives his analysis of computability, or his analysis of the human computer. And he set out 5 restrictive conditions. So now I'll just show you those 5 conditions. So the first condition is pretty, like a general, principle that the behavior of the computer, which here refers to the human computer, at any moment is determined by the symbols which he is observing and his state of mind at that moment. So, which basically means that, if you know the observed square and you know which state the computer or the human computer is in, then the behavior of the human computer. So there's no need for something extra, for the human computer to compute. So this is, because in Turing's time, that the human computer are normally women who is doing computation following a set of computation books, right? So the book basically gives the structure, and the human computer does not necessarily need to know much mathematics, and he or she, just read the instructions, and the instructions are basically just like, if you observe something and you just change it, and so on and so on. So that's the basic principle, and all the other conditions are for the qualification of the condition 1. So the condition 2 is that there is a bound B to the number of symbols or squares which the computer can observe at one moment. So that's qualification to the symbol to the symbols which he is observing in condition 1. And condition 3 is that the number of states of mind which need to be taken into account is finite. So that's for the qualification of the state of mind condition. And this is also a condition that I'm going to revisit it at the end of this talk. So condition 4 is that in a simple operation, not more than one symbol is altered. So that's a qualification to the behavior of the computer. And condition 5 is that each of the new observed squares is within L square of the immediately previously observed square. Again, that's also a qualification of the behavior of the human computer. So that's the qualification that Turing had for the human computer. That's his analysis for what conditions that the human computer needs to be satisfied in computing a number. So, and after that, then, the Turing machine concept follows immediately from his analysis of the human computer. So what he wrote here is that, so we may now construct a machine to do the work of the computer. So to each state of mind of the computer corresponds M configuration of the machine. So that's the condition 3 of the human computer. So the machine scans B squares corresponding to the B squares observed by the computer. So that's condition 2. So in any move, the machine can change a symbol on the scanned square or can change any one of the scanned square to another square distant not more than L squares from one of the other scanned square. That's conditions 4 and 5. So the move which is down and the succeeding configuration are determined by the scan symbol and the M configuration. So that's condition 1. So you can see that really, I mean, the notion of the Turing machine, which arguably is more well known, is just a concept that follows from Turing's analysis of the human computer. Where you scan this term, it's just a codification of Turing's analysis of computability. So I hope that so far I gave you some sense, of Turing's analysis of computability. So it's not about the Turing machine; it's about the human computer, and he gave several conditions of the human computer needs to satisfy, and then the Turing machine concept follows from his analysis of the human computer. But there are different interpretations of the Turing's analysis of computability, because, I mean, even though, I mean, it's a bit of uncontroversial to say, what it is, because it's just written on the paper, but it's a little bit controversial to say that what's the motivation, what's justification, and what's the implication of his analysis of computability. So that's subject to our interpretations. And there are different interpretations in the literature, if you look at it, and many of them are different. Some of them are slightly different, some of them are dramatically different. So I want to use the term, the cognitive and non-cognitive of computability, which Jack Copeland and Orange Square used in their 2013 paper, which they talk about the cognitive approaches to computability and non-cognitive approach to computability. So according to some commentators, so Turing's analysis of computability is about the human mind. So for example, so this is Hodges again saying, what Turing had done in computable number was to combine such a naive mechanistic picture of the mind with the precise logic of pure mathematics. So in some sense, according to Hodges, Turing's analysis of computability is about the human mind. So this is what Copeland and Square called the cognitive approach to computability, which they said the cognitive approach offers conditions 1 to 5 as reflections of or abstractions from limitations on human cognitive capacities. These limitations give warrant to or justify the correctness of the restrictive conditions. According to the cognitive approach, computability is constrained by conditions 1 to 5 because these constraints reflect the limitation of human cognitive capacities as these capacities are involved in calculation, or as we shall say for short, because these constraints reflect limitations of the faculty of calculation. So according to this approach, according to this reading, the cognitive approach would say, so why Turing gave those 5 restrictive conditions? Because our cognitive capacities are limited, right? So so Turing's analysis of computability just reflects the limitation of our human cognitive limitations, right? So I don't have much time to give more examples, but then there are, alternative view saying, the non-cognitive interpretations which Copeland and Square endorsed, and they characterize this as saying the non-cognitivist, on the other hand, does not think that the restrictive conditions 1 to 5 necessarily reflect limitations on human cognitivities. The non-cognitives need not deny the existence of a faculty of calculation. The claim is that its limitation do not warrant the restrictive conditions. So according to the non-cognitives, conditions 1 to 5 merely explicit the concept of effective computation as it is properly used and as it functions in the discourse of logic and mathematics. the non-cognitives offers no other justification for the 5 conditions. So in fact, a call for further justification might have a place at all in the analysis of computability or according to the non-cognitivist. So let me just briefly use one example to elaborate it to, that's my end, final remarks. So let's look at condition 3. So condition 3 says, we will also suppose that the number of states of mind which need to be taken into account is finite. So cognitive would say, oh, look, that our states of mind is finite. So Turing then, therefore, Turing just set out this because he wants to reflect or characterize what happens in our mind. And so therefore, he gave this condition 3. But unfortunately, I mean, there's a very common objection to this reading is that Turing in uncomputable numbers said, we can, if you want, remove all the use of states of mind with a more physical and definite counterpart of it, which means a note of instructions. So in other words, that we can rewrite according to Turing uncomputable numbers by replacing every occurrence of the state of mind by the counterpart, which is the note of instructions. So in this sense, that there's really no place for the cognitive reading because the cognitive term state of mind might not even occur in uncomputable numbers. So, so towards this, so at the end of this talk, so I want to say that so this is, I think, still an issue that we should debate because whatever you think that Turing's analysis of computability is cognitive or non-cognitive, the task is to make a consistent argument for each of the conditions. So each of the 5 conditions to give the reasons to, whether or not you think it's cognitive or non-cognitive. And I think this is still a task that we need to do because it's a very important question and concerning how we understand Turing's analysis of computability and also concerning what sort of objections that we could make to his analysis of computability. And I don't think I have time to elaborate this, but so thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor, for your brilliant presentation. And continuing with our panel, I would like to invite Professor Xudong from Beijing Normal University to begin his talk on a Spinozist approach to AI. Professor, okay, you have 45 minutes too. Also, and I would like to know when there are 5 minutes remaining.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. And in fact, what I'm going to say is very far from what Professor Fan Zhao has discussed, because I'm not really a professional philosopher of artificial intelligence, neither of the technology, etc. But of course, there are some questions which I have heard is very interesting in his presentation, because he talked about the state of mind, which is a term used by Turing. And I think that's very interesting because I'm not sure he's using this term for machines, for human computers, human or as machine, because what I'm going to say from a Spinozist point of view is somehow a critique of those philosophical presuppositions of the discussion about consciousness, state of mind, and etc. So okay, I will begin my presentation, which named very simply as some reflections on artificial intelligence from a Spinozist point of view. Before starting, I would like to say that, in fact, I'm going to first justify my approach and clarify in certain degree my philosophical gestures to those problems in general. Because the question I think should be asked first, at least for me, is that on the first level, why we need philosophy to talk about artificial intelligence, or what kind of role could philosophy play on the issue of artificial intelligence? Because I don't take the idea that philosophy can talk about everything what happened in the world, because in that case, philosophy won't have its own content. So it's kind of a chatting of no matter what. So I'm doing some very, very basic research on the area of philosophy of the so-called philosophy of artificial intelligence. I have noticed that there are maybe two remarkable attitudes which prevail this domain. Let's call the first approach an explicative approach, which aims at explicating the nature of artificial intelligence as a radical new phenomenon in both technology and human nature. So the essential task of this approach is to understand not only the mechanism of artificial intelligence, which might be the job of AI researchers or cognitive scientists, but also in what sense the operation of such machines can or cannot be called as intelligent. In other words, if it was taken as granted that intelligence is a human privilege, in what aspect the machine differs or not from human intellect. The explicative attitude then will be twofold. On the one hand, it uses human thought as a model to understand the computational operations of machines. And on the other hand, the success of building the so-called intelligent machines or artificial intelligence could also help us to understand the nature of thought in general, no matter the thought is of human or not. And the second philosophical attitude, which is not necessarily in opposition with the first, could be called a regulative or normative one. This approach especially concerns social and ethical problems. Related questions then could be divided into two groups, depending on whether the artificial intelligence is considered as a social agent, more or less equal to human, or as a new but powerful technical instrument. It's not a human, it's not an agent. So in the first case, essential and problematic concept will be that of free will, choice making, and in corresponding the concept of responsibility, which was always thought to be the essential concept in operation for understanding ethics and politics. This understanding, in fact, resonates some scenarios we could find in science fictions. For example, the famous film, we all know that Blade Runner, or some Japanese animation, which is called Ghost in Shell. There are always those stories about how Android and human-made artificial intelligence are taken as members of society and cause a lot of ethical and political problems. But intuitively, it might be difficult to attribute the idea of responsibility to machines. So Android as AI machines, which can act in the same way as human beings living in human society, seems to be a future very far from our society and our reality. But this conception might not be so fantastic and fictional, because in certain cases, in reality, for example, the auto driving system, it is already becoming a real challenge. And in the second case, we could take a weaker stance, affirming that artificial intelligence cannot be a social agent, so that it cannot be a member of society, at least in its present state. If we divide elements in society into two parts, very simply and briefly, one part is human beings, which are the social agents and the members of society. Then the other part consists of non-human beings, like materials, products, and especially instruments. The artificial intelligence as a machine then could be seen as an instrument which differs in nature from human, but only differs in degree from other instruments. Like a knife is used by human to cut, the intelligent machine is used by human to do more complex tasks. But this doesn't mean the problems related to AI will automatically be dissolved. It's true that interaction between human and machine is no longer a social relation, but as a revolutionary technology, the development of artificial intelligence will undoubtedly influence the way in which society is organized. The questions are not only ethical, like how to code machines ethically, but also political, because the technological revolution means necessarily a great progress in productivity. which, according to classical Marxist conception, will influence and even threat the existing relations of production radically. So this is the basic frame in which, according to my understanding, philosophy can intervene in the domain of artificial intelligence. And the second question is, why Spinoza? Why I choose a Spinozist perspective to analyze those problems? There's no need to deny the fact that because I, as a person, I have written my doctoral dissertation on Spinoza, particularly on Spinozist ontology, so that the Spinozist tradition is the most available philosophical resource that I can rely on. But this reason is somehow too personal and enough to justify a scientific investigation on this issue. So again, why Spinoza? The first reason could be an observation of the state of research that has been done in the domain of philosophy of artificial intelligence. In fact, according to my very limited knowledge, it seems to me that the majority of discussions on this issue are based on contemporary Anglo-Saxon tradition of philosophy. That is to say, they are based on analytical philosophy, including the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of language, etc. Of course, those traditions are very pertinent, very powerful, and could be applied to the problem of artificial intelligence without difficulty. But if the philosophical problem of artificial intelligence is an authentic and general one, then it deserves treatment from other different perspectives. Although the divergence in the philosophy of mind, of language is remarkable, I still have the impression that the different approaches inside analytical philosophy share some common horizon. They share certain hypotheses which are derived from the Cartesian, Humean, and even Kantian tradition. The way they talk about consciousness, about thought, about mind, about proposition and language shows that in a larger scale, those philosophies belong to the philosophy of subject, of consciousness, or in another word, they belong to a kind of transcendental philosophy or a kind of empiricism, sorry for the word. So these models can only represent a very limited tendency in history of philosophy in general. A lot of alternatives in ontology, in epistemology, and even ethics are not well mobilized. So is the case of Spinoza, whose importance in history of thought can never be underestimated. But however, it's not enough to say it is possible to use no matter which philosopher in history to analyze the artificial intelligence as a contemporary phenomenon. If I choose Spinozism as the lens to look at the artificial intelligence, it is also because comparing to other philosophical systems, Spinozism can provide some very particular insight. There might be, as I will try to illustrate in the following parts, certain compatibility of Spinozist conception of the world, of mind, of human being with the emergence of such powerful thinking machines in over time. Spinoza, in fact, is famous for his atheist claim that God is nothing but nature itself. Here comes the very famous formula that Div Stivna Duha. But if we accept that humanism is the last form of theology, Spinoza also criticized radically all kinds of humanism, all kinds of conception which admit a special position of human being in the world, or admit certain privilege of human, which cannot be shared by other beings. In his own word, human is not an empire inside another empire. To put it more clearly, it means that there is not an empire of human which differs from the empire of nature itself. So that is to say, whatever exists in nature obeys the same law with no exception. This conception is important in the case of AI because, as far as I observed, a lot of philosophical challenges of the artificial intelligence, in fact, are challenges to the privilege of human being. How should we conceive our own existence as human beings if machines can also think as we do? Isn't the faculty of think the last symbol, even the shelter of human superiority above other creatures? But for Spinoza, the fact that a machine can think as us, or even better than us, is not only predictable, but in certain degree already accepted. Because intelligence is not a special faculty of human, and humans have no privilege at all. Thus, for Spinozist as I am, there is no identity crisis or existential anxiety facing the emergence of powerful artificial intelligence. There will be, of course, ethical and political difficulties, but there is no difficulty to admit that the so-called artificial intelligence is intelligent as human is considered to be. This is, in fact, the conclusion I would like to prove from a Spinozist point of view. So the rest of the presentation concerns mainly the nature of artificial intelligence, and particularly the term intelligence. What does it mean? I have to argue that even at the present time, the work of the ChatGPT, for example, could do what it could do shows that it has already enough capacity to be called intelligence in its full sense. I would like to prove that the intelligence of a machine doesn't differ in nature from that of human. There's not an essential difference. The arguments will be principally negative, in fact. It aims to prove that the notion of consciousness and related notions like understanding or meaning are not a constitutive element in the definition of what is called intelligence. In what sense, so, a machine like ChatGPT, as an excellent example, can be called intelligent? And in what sense, an artificial intelligent machine's intelligence is equal to that of human or not? The question of conscious seems to be the central in debate. As far as we could observe nowadays, an intelligent machine can calculate, can talk, can even play the games of chess and Go, and they play better than human beings. We have already observed the history. So they can even write articles in natural language as humans do. Maybe some other professors have already get some assignment from students which are written by the ChatGPT. That's I have read a lot of news about it. But facing such an astonishing phenomenon, one of the main arguments we can use to deny that the machines have intelligence, as we do, is to affirm that all those works they could do is just a computational operation. So machines do not really understand what they are thinking as we do. So they are not really thinking, but just operating certain algorithm. In other words, even if in appearance, in talking with a chat robots, we have the false impression that they are thinking, in reality, they are not, because they don't have consciousness and they are not conscious of what they are doing. They don't have mental states or state of mind and don't understand what they say. So put it more strictly, they just output. Consciousness then becomes the distinctive property which differentiates the human intelligence as a faculty of thought and the artificial intelligence, which is not a real intelligence, but just a reckoning and computation, just a mechanic process. As far as we accept such a distinction, the possibility of a real artificial intelligence machine will depend on other question. That is the possibility of a conscious machine. Because consciousness is considered to be an essential and constitutive element of intelligence. A lot of philosophical discussions then have taken place on this direction. According to the resume of Tuan Fei Qing, a Singapore professor who works on this subject, the arguments support the impossibility of conscious machine are basically in two kinds. The first argues for a kind of metaphysical impossibility, which suggests that machines, however sophisticated in functional or computational terms, cannot be conscious. This is the main idea, in fact, of Bloch, Stern, Motley, who used some famous thought experiment to arrive at this conclusion, like the experiment of Searle's Chinese room or Bloch's Chinese nation. The second kind of argument aims rather the practical impossibility of building an artificial consciousness or conscious machine. For example, that is the idea of Martin Levine Chalmers. For them, insofar as we do not yet have a full and complete understanding of how human consciousness can arise from physical states, we cannot really, in a reversed direction, to build practically a conscious machine based on physical mechanism. In fact, the two kinds of impossibility of artificial consciousness are not only distinguished as metaphysical and practical, but they might, as far as I understand, taken as they might correspond to two determinations of what the consciousness is, or at least the consciousness was thought to be. It is always taken as granted that we as human beings have consciousness, and consciousness is the most immediate experience we have. So intuitively, it seems that all of us know what conscious is when we are using this concept. However, paradoxically, on conceptual and analytical level, what is understood as consciousness does not yet have a fine definition. Employing a Cartesian expression, consciousness is something clear. That means it is vivid in our perception or imagination, but it is not distinctive, meaning that it lacks conceptual determination in theory. Nevertheless, we can still draw two presupposed properties of consciousness from the above impossibility. Corresponding to the metaphysical impossibility, consciousness is in fact understood as a kind of awareness. In the case of intelligence, it means that when human thinks, he does not only effectuate a conceptual operation, connects different ideas to form a thought, but he is aware of what he's doing, and he understands and he knows the meaning of what he's doing. This is what a machine cannot achieve. And the practical impossibility of building consciousness emphasizes the immaterial nature of it. The real question then is not practical, meaning that we do not know yet how to make consciousness out of physical materials, but rather how to produce the immaterial from the material. The mystery of consciousness before scientific apprehension is in fact its presupposed immaterial nature. It cannot be detected, measured, examined in any given physical system. In short, let's see, awareness and immateriality are the two distinctive properties of what conscious is, or at least what prevents machines to have consciousness and then to be called in full sense intelligence. So what Spinoza could help us in this question? Frankly speaking, Spinoza cannot help us to overcome the impossibility of building a conscious machine if the conscious is understood in the way we have described above. On the contrary, by referring to the Spinozist conception, I'd like to point out that the concept of consciousness itself is somehow an excessive notion for intelligence. Of course, Spinoza had never talked about artificial intelligence, but in his conception of human intellect, there is no need to add another faculty called consciousness beyond the operational connections and combinations of ideas. Thought, in its content, is just those connections, combinations. And the human mind is in this sense nothing but a spiritual automaton. This is the expression of Spinoza himself. Therefore, from a Spinozist point of view, if human intellect can work without the not well-defined notion of consciousness as an independent faculty, why should we demand it excessively and harshly for machines? So what is Spinoza's conception of human mind as a spiritual automaton? Instead of illustrating it systematically, I prefer here to respond to the thought experiment proposed by Searle and Bloch with a Spinozist answer. The well-known Chinese room example can be resumed in this way. Someone called Mary, who knows nothing of Chinese, is put in a room, which is equipped with paired cards in both English and Chinese. So when she receives an information in Chinese, she can use those cards to find the corresponding English and then translate, but without really understand the Chinese into English. Then she can easily output this in the same way Chinese responds to the outsider. In a functionalist view, Mary behaves perfectly as someone who speaks Chinese, but in reality, that is not the case, for she does not understand Chinese, and there is a visible difference between her and someone who really understands Chinese. According to Searle, the machines that seem to think, to talk, they work probably in the same way as the example of Chinese room. Mary can, in an improper sense, use Chinese, but in fact, she cannot understand it as a real Chinese speaker. Or maybe we can draw a different conclusion that it's not Mary as an individual who speaks and understands Chinese. It is she with the room together, seen as a system who has the capacity of using this mysterious Oriental language. But in this case, it is still counterintuitive, because how could a system to have an understanding, or to mean a system, how can a system to have a mind? In fact, the experiment of Chinese nation proposed by Bloch aims exactly at this interpretation. For Bloch, we can imagine an emperor in China who demands the people, millions of people in China, to communicate messages like what happened between neurons in your brain. And the empire in its totality can then simulate the process happened in brain. It can receive inputs and produce outputs. But can we say the empire has a mind? Does the empire, not the emperor, neither and not any individual in the empire, has the capacity to think? The Spinozist answer to both experiments would be a yes. For the Chinese room experiment, Spinoza would agree that it is the system, meaning Mary and the room in together, has a mind which is capable to think. And for the Chinese nation problem, Spinoza also will agree that the empire has a mind. In fact, quite surprisingly, Spinoza not only take a state, a country, a state to be an individual. This is the thesis analyzed a lot by a great Spinozist researcher, Alexandre Madéron, who has proved that in Spinoza there is the conception that a state can be seen as an individual. There is isomorphism between the two levels. And Spinoza even has talked, in fact, in his own work, Spinoza has talked about the soul of state or the mind of state. That's also his own expression. So those expressions for him are not metaphorical. It might be counterintuitive, but it's because of intuition are so tightly limited to common sense. And in common sense, we always presume an individual subject to be the agent of thought. We focus too much on the individual integrity of each person so that we have difficulties to think about the thought below or beyond the limitation of individual existence. But this is not our task here. I mentioned this just to point out that there is the possibility of conceiving mind and thought outside individual human body. In fact, how the two thought experiments work, or in what way they can serve the theory as an argument. We believe that they can work as arguments because in admitting the hypothesis of the adversary, they lead to absurd conclusion. But as far as I understood them, the absurdity of neither conclusion of the Chinese nation or of the Chinese room is a contradiction. They are not a contradiction. They provoke absurdity. It's just because the conclusion is counterintuitive. In other words, they are absurd because they don't fit over common sense. But it's not the job for philosophers to modify philosophy itself to adjust for the common sense. On the contrary, I think the real work of philosophy should go beyond the common sense, either to find its philosophical foundation or to prove its falsity. So let's be more serious and analyze what really happens in the case of the Chinese room. In conceptual level, what Searle wants to emphasize is that a machine which works like the Chinese room cannot be called a strong AI, that is to say, an artificial intelligence capable of thinking like human, because it does not understand what it outputs. It is not aware of the process happens inside its computational operation. The model of human intellect or of a strong AI then consists of at least two parts. On the one hand, there are concepts or ideas which are the elements of deduction, of calculation, of connection, or of combination. On this level, what an artificial intelligence can do seems to be the same as what a human can do. But on the other hand, in difference from machine, human beings are aware of what they are thinking, and they understand the content of their thoughts. Although what awareness or understanding the meaning signifies is still somehow mystic. If we situate this model in history of philosophy in a larger scale, it seems to me that this way of understanding human mind is very Cartesian in its secret kernel. We have a cogito which can be deprived of all its contents, all contents of thought, that it means the positive and concrete ideas. It is just the end point of the doubting process that cannot be doubted anymore. And we have a will, a volonté of in Descartes, which do not necessarily in accordance with the deduction or combinatory chains of ideas. The will then is a faculty to confirm the ideas which are considered to be passive images. That is where the theory of true or false is grounded for him. This model, as in the philosophy of Descartes, works in itself, but it is remarkable that it leaves some obscure quality which evades comprehensible explication. For Descartes, it is the cogito and the will, and for Husserl, it is the consciousness as awareness or as the subjective meaning. So here, we are going to use the Spinozist model, which is a critical modification of the Cartesian vision to respond to the challenge that Husserl proposed. In short, for Spinoza, there is no separate consciousness, neither separate will. Outside, they don't exist outside the ideas themselves. Thought, or let's call it intelligence in our case, is nothing but the combination and the composition of ideas, from simple ideas to composite or complex ideas. What is called consciousness and will should not be considered as other faculties, but they are just an inherent dimension of ideas themselves. What is the consciousness or awareness then, in fact? The basic dimension of ideas, the basic formula could be the following. Instead of simply claiming that I think of X, that means I have the idea of X in Spinozist terms, the awareness is the confirmation of this fact in a secondary level. It can be put like, I know, or I'm aware that I think of X. This structure might be the origin of the separate consciousness as an independent faculty or as a meta-structure similar to what Kant later calls a perception. But for Spinoza, who represents, in fact, in history of philosophy, the contrary tendency to this kind of transcendental philosophy of subject, this structure can be read in another way. No, there is no need to introduce some consciousness or awareness independent of ideas, but on the contrary, it is a secondary level of the affirmation of one idea by another idea. To put it more clearly, the formulation of I know I have the idea of X should be read as I have the idea of X. More concretely, for example, I have the idea of the table. Then to say that I know I have the idea of the table signifies that I have the idea of the table. It's quite sophisticated, but it's the way how Spinoza puts it. So in this case, consciousness, insofar as it is understood as awareness, is just the idea of idea in Spinoza. It's just a special way to reproduce ideas, but not something beyond the field of ideas themselves. So back to the question of artificial intelligence. If we agree that operation of ideas described by Spinoza can be achieved by machines, then a machine can have consciousness, they can have idea of ideas, like they can validate or confirm certain computational operations inside its own system. Or if we insist on understanding the term consciousness in its traditional Cartesian root as some mystic, subjective faculty to be aware, to confirm, then for Spinoza, neither human nor machine have consciousness in this sense. The structure between consciousness and ideas is thus reversed. The conscious is secondary to ideas and can be produced by ideas and not vice versa. Consciousness, or more precisely awareness, is just a very special disposition of ideas among others, and it does not even play an essential role. Even for us human beings, we always have ideas, but we are not necessarily aware of all the time that we have ideas. The fact that I see a table doesn't include necessarily that I have the judgment in mind that I know I see the table. Each idea contains its own affirmation and not need to be confirmed on the secondary level. The secondary confirmation, like in the judgment of awareness, can be done, especially in case of uncertainty, but it is not even a universal situation. Another related question concerns the meaning or understanding the meaning of the thinking process. In denouncing the implicit subject structure which supports the consciousness conception, what is called understanding or meaning will be nothing else but the efficient deduction and connection of ideas. Insofar we have ideas and ideas are correctly or even wrongly combined, then there will be meaning and we understand them. We don't need to, according to the Spinozist conception, search for meaning inside the profound darkness of the subject or of the consciousness. If the argument in this way is not easy to grasp, maybe a counterexample could be helpful. Let's just put aside the machines, ask ourselves as human beings, what does it mean exactly to understand something? Or more extremely, what does it mean? It means for me to say that I understand an axiom of mathematics. The answer is, when I am able to use the axiom correctly, when I am able to produce other ideas from what is already given. Sure, in daily life, we sometimes can have very ambiguous feelings that we understand something but cannot really formulate it. I think it's quite a common experience, especially for students and researchers in philosophy. After reading Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit for 10 hours, I might have understood something, even though I cannot explicate Hegel's thought to someone else. I just have the feeling that, yeah, maybe I understood. But sadly, I would like to say, in this case, I do not really understand. Maybe I have some inadequate ideas of the knowledge I'm learning, but I am not able to output it. No professor would give me the score if I write down under a mathematical question that I understood, but somehow I cannot write the demonstration. So even for human beings, the functionalist conception would be a sufficient criteria for what understanding means. Then again, this works for human. We should not ask machines to do more. Now let's turn to the second impossibility of conscious machine, that of practical impossibility, or as I prefer to call it, the immateriality of consciousness. As Maxine, Levine, and Chalmers claims, it is impossible for us to create a real conscious machine because we do not know yet how the mental states as immature existence can be produced by physical states. This proposition consists, in fact, also of two parts. On the one hand, it says that consciousness is immaterial, different in nature from the mechanism in our brain, in the body, different in nature from all the material world. On the other hand, it claims that we don't know how the consciousness can be produced by physical dispositions of matters. Or put it more generally, we don't know how the immaterial existence, or at least the immaterial phenomenon, can be produced by matters. So that's two different levels of the same proposition. And the conclusion that conscious machine is impossible is a combination of the two. First, there is the very classical dualist distinction at work between thought and matter, or extension in terms of modern philosophy. Second, human is considered to have both a body and a mind, or conscious. Third, a machine built by human is built out of matters, and matters are not immaterial, and we don't know how can they produce immaterial things. Fourth and last, we don't know how to build a conscious machine. Conscious machine then is practically impossible. What will be a Spinozist view on this issue? In fact, Spinoza would agree that with the first part of the proposition, which affirms the real distinction between thought and extension. Yes, we know Spinoza is a monism, but it's a strange monism because he never denied the real distinction between attributes, thought and extension. There's no connection at all. But for him, the second part of the proposition is not well formulated. The essential question is whether or not, the essential question is not whether or not we can know the possible causality between conscious and the brain, the immature and the mature, but rather we should first ask whether there is such a causality, even in the case of human being. On claiming the impossibility in practical is practical, it seems that we have implicitly admit such a causality from human brain to human conscious. But this is already problematic. All this discussion in fact resonates the permanent philosophical debate of the mind-body problem. So in order to better illustrate the special concept of Spinoza, we can here illustrate a minimal schema of different possibilities. Between the two terms, mind and body, the immaterial and the material, there might be in general 3 basic approaches. We can affirm the superiority of the body in 2 ways. Either we refuse the existence of the immaterial, taking a very radical reductionist position. But the difficulty is obvious. In contemporary terms, there are always something in thought called a qualia, which can never be reduced to physical property. So we can maybe take a weaker materialist position, claiming that both the immaterial and the material exist, but the immaterial, the thought, is somehow mystically produced by the matter, by the body. In contrast, there is a certain strong idealist tradition, which affirms the priority of mind over body. We can find the case of the transcendental idealism of Kant or the absolute idealism of Hegel. But this approach is somehow not very pertinent to this question we are investigating here, so I'm not, I guess, the least the possibility. And the third one is the parallelism of Spinoza. Of course, the parallelism can have different varieties, like the pre-established harmony in Leibniz or the occasionalism of Malebranche. But the principle is shared by all of them. There is no need to decide the priority of body over mind or of mind over body. They are both real and they operate independently, but in parallel, as if there is some causality, but in reality, there is none. So what does this background have to do with the possibility or impossibility of conscious machine? Again, my aim is not to respond directly to the question, but rather to analyze the presumptions or the suppositions inside the structure on which the question are asked. According to a brief reconstruction of argument for the practical impossibility of conscious machine, we can see that it already accepted without saying it the first approach of mind-body problem. So there is a causality between mind and body. It presumes the possible causality between human conscious and the body, and it denies inside the same presumption the parallel attribute of thought in matters. And so in machines which are not human, they cannot have thought. And the real problem is then how to produce immaterial thought in the case of machines, as if like the case in human. So from a Spinozist point of view, both presumptions are not self-evident. First, why should consciousness and even thought be seen as a privileged mental state of human? Animals can have thought, so machines too. For Spinoza, everything, insofar as it has a body, insofar as it exists, has thought. The extreme case can be that of a stone. Yes, a stone can have a mind in a very minimal degree, so it is barely visible. There is only a difference in degree between the thought of human being and other existence, depends on the complexity of their structure, but there is no difference in nature. A dog can think, a plant can think. So if the machine is sophisticated enough, there is no a priori reason to refuse that it shares the attribute of thought which prevails the nature everywhere. If this is the case, then the second presumption will also be destroyed. We don't need to find the causality which enables the production of thought or conscious from the material disposition, because In the parallelism view, there is already thought corresponding to the material disposition. What happened in the building of machines' intelligence is not a production of thought ex nihilo, but an organization of thought in parallel with the organization of the body. Machines appears to have thought from nowhere, but in fact, it just gets a higher degree of thought from the invisible level, like that of a stone, to a visible and even shocking level, like that of a human. Therefore, the practical impossibility is not an impossibility a priori. If the immateriality of thought is not a privilege of human, then for a sophisticated machine to have it is not unimaginable. For the limit of time, I won't get into ethical and political discussions of the artificial intelligence from the Spinozist point of view, but that doesn't mean Spinoza has nothing to say about it. In fact, by refusing the privilege of human being as an umpire inside an empire, Spinoza also criticized radically the notion of free will, so that he establishes an ethics, not a morality, there's a distinction, without the concepts of intention, free will, and responsibility, which could be very inspiring, as far as I see it, for the contemporary philosophical investigations of AI ethics and politics. So in the end, to recapitulate what is said above, the basic idea of Spinoza is that human is not special in the nature. Consciousness, awareness, and immateriality of thought, all those notions cannot be used to distinguish the intelligence of human being and the artificial intelligence. In principle, they do not constitute the real content of thought, which means the combination and composition of ideas. And in theoretical practice, if they are used in an improper way to human beings, then they can be used analogically to machines. I think when Spinoza claims in the proposition 16 of the first part of ethics that all that is comprehensible can be produced by God, he did not rule out the possibility of machines can think, can act, can talk as we do, or even better than us. That's all I like to share with you guys. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for sharing your brilliant insights, Professor. Now I open the session for questions, which can be submitted through the chat or here. I will follow the order of the chat. Professor Nitamar, would you like to start?
Yes, thanks, Camila. Well, thank you very much, Zhao and Xudong, for these beautiful and extremely interesting presentations. I'll make a very quick question to each one of you guys, but they relate to the same problem, namely philosophy of mathematics. Perhaps starting with Xudong, I think, of course, your reading of Spinoza is excellent. We got to talk a lot about Spinoza when we were in Paris working with Charles Ramon. And of course, there are many controversial issues relating philosophy of mathematics in Spinoza, because as you pointed out, for the idea of human intelligence, precisely, this is the point that we need emotions, and you even spoke of consciousness, and this is something that's quite questionable and debatable when we talk about artificial intelligence. However, when it comes to Spinoza's usage of geometry in mathematics overall, he has a clear understanding of this conception of what would be later called a priori, right? A priori. And of course, in Hume could be relations of ideas, very much in the way Spinoza talks about ideas, or in Kant, the a priori, as opposed to the a posteriori. But the major thing for Spinoza is precisely that you can separate these conceptions of things that work in mathematics, like in geometry. But on the other hand, he is a monistic, as you pointed out. Therefore, Spinoza does not believe in innate ideas like Descartes. So he's not a Platonist. That's where the real problems begin. And of course, Professor Otávio Bueno and philosophers of mathematics can much better than any one of us talk about this huge problem about mathematical Platonism. But my question to you, Xudong, is precisely how would you account for this very problem? That at the same time, Spinoza is a monist, so he's not a dualist, and yet you're trying to clarify that his conception of intelligence cannot be completely abstract from human experience. So in the way you described, but okay, this is just a provocation. It's just my general question. You used the Chinese room thought experiment by Searle. It's a very interesting point, but I'm not sure that this is the only way people talking about Spinoza, as you know, would say that Spinoza would side with Searle or with other people that more empiricists and who would call into question qualia and phenomenological approaches to this very problem of the Chinese room. Now, to Zhao, I'm very grateful for your paper, and my general question is precisely relating to the Entscheidungs problem, which was the way you introduced the Turing machine. And it's very interesting, therefore, that you, at the beginning of the 20th century, you had to resort to meta-mathematics in order to account for Hilbert's version of the Entscheidungs problem. And it's interesting to remark, as you talked about Turing and Wittgenstein, that Wittgenstein's conception of a set theory, for instance, in the Tractatus, is very much similar to Alonzo Church's lambda calculus. And I was curious to see how would you respond to this, that, for instance, someone like Turing was making it empirical and material to resort to the tape, right, to do a Entscheidung problem account of undecidability, while someone like Gödel or Church would have a formal, logical approach to this very problem. How would you respond to this provocation? Thank you very much. I don't know if perhaps Professor Bueno wants to connect to these questions. Feel free to do whatever way is better for the two speakers.
I think it's fine for them to answer your questions, and then I'll ask mine.
Okay, so maybe I start first to answer the question of Nita. Yeah, it's very about how to say it, because if I understood your question correctly, you just mentioned that there might be some kind of tension between the Spinozist monism worldview with what I've said about the mathematical nature, the how to say the mathematical nature of intelligence as described there. But in fact, maybe I can say it with somehow more confidence because I have done a lot of work on Spinoza. So in this case, if I say some proposition very radical and very different from the mainstream understanding, I think I have enough work done on this field, because I have a very special understanding of what the monism of Spinoza. In fact, it's not only my own interpretation, it's also shared by Pierre Marcheret and what's the name of that professor? Morgens Lerck, also a big Spinozist and Leibnizian. And I agree with them that in fact the monist substance in Spinoza should not be considered as a Neoplatonician the one. It's not a one. In fact, there is only one substance in Spinoza. It's just because there is nothing outside of it. So it's the totality, but it is not the oneness. And from that starting point, I would argue that in fact the true nature of what is called substance in Spinoza is a sort of ontological multiplicity. So there is what is priori in Spinoza is not the oneness, some one unity, some one entity existing as a nature, as a God, whatever. But it's just the multiplicity, the difference, or the elements which wait to be combined. So that's not only the logic of intelligence, like ideas are combined from the simple ideas to more complex ideas, but also the composition of body. I think that is the part Spinoza talks more explicitly about his conception of how a body is composed. He talks about the simplest body to the complex body. And this same logic, as far as I understood, but I didn't develop it positively in this presentation. But in fact, in Spinoza, there is not only a mathematical understanding of thought and even a physical understanding of thought. That is the famous thesis of Tocqueville, a great Spinozist, and Deleuze. I think that's the title of his dissertation, La physique de la pensée. So in this case, I don't think there is a real, there's no opposition or contradiction. There might be a tension, but it depends on how we understand the term substance. But besides, I would like to add something. You mentioned a question I didn't dare to touch, but I think it's essential for the Spinozist reading of machines and artificial intelligence is the question of emotions. Because that's a very important question for Spinoza. That's the third part of ethics, and he has a really very beautiful system of emotions, but it's too difficult for us to talk about the emotions for the machines. So maybe the machine can think, can thought, can talk like humans, but they don't really have emotions. I have some discussion with other professors, and there are certain ideas claim that maybe emotions is not some kind of privilege or advantage of human being, but it's more a default. It's some problem with us. So in this case, the artificial intelligence, in considering their capacity to work or to do something, maybe they are a better existence than human beings. But that's just a very preliminary reflection and not technical and very well developed. Yeah, that's a basic question. But still, I will take the opportunity to add a question to Fan Zhao that maybe you can just clarify a little more in what sense Alan Turing is using the term state of affairs, because I mentioned a lot mental states. I think that's quite a very philosophical understanding, and I take it as a rest of a left of the Cartesian philosophical tradition. But maybe when Turing is using it, can this term for him be used, legitimately to machines? Does machine for Turing has a kind of state of mind, even analogically speaking? Yeah, I just add a question. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So maybe I think the first point that maybe I would like to respond to Xudong, because so he just mentioned that emotion, right? Because the point that I would like to add on is that so Turing actually explicitly said that intelligence is an emotional concept. So I'm kind of very interesting to hear that just you emphasize that the concept of emotion in Spinoza's philosophy. So I think this might be something that maybe we can talk more or later or investigate it. I mean, so where actually his notion of this intelligence as an emotional concept comes from. Okay, so but this is something I want to add because you just mentioned, so I'm very excited to point this out. But going back to Professor Natama's question about the Turing machine as a kind of, so why Turing constructed a physical machine concept. So well, I think there are two questions here. I mean, so one is why he conceived a machine, right, to tackle the mathematical problem. So one explanation, which actually this is given by Max Newman in an interview in the 1970s, is that so when Newman talked about or introduced the insurance problem in his 1935 course on the foundations of mathematics, where Turing attended, Newman said in that interview that he might also mention that there might be a machine to solve the problem. So then but of course Newman is just like talk about it in a pretty general way without specifying what kind of machine it is. So if Turing attended that course and Newman really talk about there might be a machine that can solve this problem, then it is natural for Turing to to try to devise a machine to tackle this problem. But so the only evidence that we have is the Newman's interview. So it's something that and it's 1970s. It's like almost 40 years later. So perhaps we need more evidence to verify this hypothesis. But the second part that you mentioned, that the question that I think you asked is that so even if he talked about a machine concept, so it's why it's so different from Church, from Gödel, or from Kleene, or other pioneers of computability theorists. And I think one reason is that so Turing was really, away from the influence from the works of Kurt Gödel, where Church was highly influenced by the works of Gödel, where Gödel was in Princeton in the 1930s and gave talks on the insurance problem, and Church really kind of followed Gödel in working on this problem. So they are really from the same tradition. Where Turing, he is a bit of not really initially working on the foundations of mathematics. He works a lot about group theory when he was an undergraduate, and then suddenly kind of interested in the mathematical logic. And also Turing was very interested in physics when he was an undergraduate. So if you read Hodge's biography, you know that Turing was very interested in the works of like Eddington and others. So then it's so if he's kind of not really from this tradition, then I think it's not very surprising that he produced something different from people who were from this tradition. But whether or not, I would say it's a dual notion of machine, because on the one hand, it's still a mathematical concept. It's he's not saying the computability is bounded by the physical aspect of the machine, so it's still a mathematical concept. But on the other hand, it's something that can be physicalized. So there's a dual notion of the machine. So whether or not this is something that might have some input from Wittgenstein is something that I'm not sure. So there's something that we need to investigate it further. So that's so thank you very much for your question.
Professor Otávio, you can be the next. Go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you both for both very interesting and provocative talks. I have a question for each of you. So first, I apologize for mispronouncing both of your names, but first to Zhao Fan. So I thought your talk was beautiful, very clear, nicely laid out, and very sensible. So one question I have is about on the cognitivist, non-cognitivist interpretations of Turing. It seems to me that the cognitivist faces actually some serious difficulties. So it's very interesting the way that Turing formulates the 5 conditions that you lay out. I think it's telling that when he introduced the notion of mental state, right, or the word he well, state of mind is the word he uses. He put square codes in it, right? So I think that's an indication that he knows very well that he's not talking about real states of mind, that he's considering an abstraction, right? That he's considering an idealized type of machine. Now, of course, the cognitivist says, well, but why is he introducing these constraints then if they are not human constraints, right? And I think the answer, and you mentioned that briefly, is, well, he's interested in addressing effective computation, right? If he has a conception of computation in which there are no limits of any kind, well, it's implausible that the notion that he has is the one of effective computation. So I think the issue of whether humans are like Turing machines is beside the point. And in a way, I think, very disingenuous for the cognitivists. Look, for example, in terms of the constraints, it's not that what he's considering is simplified so that it adjusts to mental capacities, right? Because, for example, some of the constraints are ridiculously narrow relative to the mental capacities we have, right? So the idea that, for example, each of the new observed square is within L squares of an immediately previously observed square. Well, mental human capacities go way beyond that, right? Even if, though, sure, we are finite, we can process a finite amount of information, but we process a lot of things at the same time, very effectively, right? At this moment, I'm seeing you, I'm speaking something in a foreign language, I'm recalling things from what I read, I'm still hearing the background noise of this truck that doesn't stop, all of those things at the same time, right? So the thought that, yes, no, I'm just focusing on this tiny little square, one thing at a time, it's ridiculous, right? As an account of mental state. And I think Turing was very much well aware of that. Hence the square codes, right? He's offering a very idealized, simplistic account so he can model effective computation. So it seems to me that, as opposed to what the cognitivist has to say, the non-cognitivist interpretation is actually far more plausible. Okay, that's my comment, and I would like to ask you, okay, what do you think, right? So, and I ask later on. I have a question to Xudong, but I would like to hear if it's okay.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Otavio, for your question. Actually, this is something that I didn't have time to elaborate. So, as you pointed out, that Turing put quotation marks around the term state of mind, and actually this is also something that the cognitivist or interpretationist was aware of, and but what they're pointing to for some fact in uncomputable numbers is that for some terms, some cognitive terms, that Turing used quotation marks, but for some in some other places, that's for some cognitive terms that Turing didn't put quotation marks. So so it's not like consistently, that he's just talking about it metaphorically, but you could argue, that he may be just not, careful enough, or maybe just in a hurry, whatever. But I think the more philosophically interesting question that I didn't have time to touch on is that so actually when we talk about the cognitive interpretation, there are actually two at least two cognitive interpretation, and one is appeal to the state of mind. So that is something which I agree with you. It's a bit of difficult for them to insist this. But the second cognitive interpretation, which is perhaps more common in the literature, appeals to our cognitive capacity in recognizing symbols. So some of the interpreters like Gandhi or Zheng, which I mentioned in the talk, said that Turing's analysis of computability is justified by the limitation of our sensory organ. So when Turing talked about why we need a finite number of states, of mind, because if we have infinite many of them, then there will be some states that are arbitrarily close and will be confused. So that's some of the reason that they think that Turing's analysis of computability is based on our cognitive capacity, or in particular our sensory capacity in recognizing symbols. So I think if we talk about the cognitive interpretation beyond, the states of mind, then there are more. It becomes more challenging to argue that this interpretation is problematic in light of Turing's Turing's onwards. There's something like that. It will be confused by us, right? There's some symbols that will be arbitrarily close, and it will be confused by us. So, but actually, I'm writing something about this currently, and I'm arguing that they are somehow misleading, and because one argument that I give in the paper, which somehow in line with what you just said, is that but maybe in a different direction, because so when Turing is talking about the finiteness of the states of mind, so we talk about the state of mind cognitive interpretation is out of the table, but what about the sensory cognitive interpretation? And when he talked about this, he appealed to the difficulties with assuming an infinity state of mind. But if his analysis of computability is really about the actuality of our, the limitation of our sensory apparatus or organ, then he don't need to appeal to an argument from infinity, because actuality speaking, that we can never have an infinite number of states of mind. And also, even though, as you mentioned, that our states of mind can do way more than what Turing assumed, but there is a very definitive, a bound for it. And of course, the cognitive scientist might be able to find the limit, but there's a limit. And compared to infinity, it's way, way far away from infinity. So if really, his argument at this point is based on some cognitive constraints, then there is just no need at all to give a reason for assuming assuming that the states of mind are infinite, right? So, but of course, then I have to explain, why he assumed, why he gave this argument for the infinity of the states of mind. But that would be a very long story, so I would just stop here. But thank you very much. I would like to, if we are interested in, I would like to continue the discussion.
Yeah, no, I would like to
offer you my.
Yeah, no, and
thank you.
I would like to see your paper as you developed. And just a quick comment, it seems to me that there are two different things. We may have a finite of course, we have finite minds, right?
Right, yes.
But there are things that are confused even within a finite set of things, right? So, for example, think about vagueness, right? Is this shade of, say, yellow, right? Is this really yellow or is this orange, right? It's finite. We can point where the location, where it is, but it might be unclear, right? Well, if you approach from one side, it looks like orange. If you approach from the other side, it looks like yellow. Is that yellow or orange? Even though it's perfectly finite. So I think those are two separate things, finiteness and lack of precision. We may have perfectly imprecise things that are completely finite, right? And
Yes.
so I think those, it's important to separate those things, which I think the cognitivists might be running together in their challenge of Turing, right? And so, and of course, look, we all know, having an infinitely long tape is an idealization, right? And Turing knew that, of course, right? But he would not be able to capture the content of computation even with arithmetic if he had a finite tape, right? He ran out of space, right, to express the content of computation. So that, again, is being guided not by, I think, cognitivist reasons, by being guided by mathematical reasons. You want to capture the notion of effective computation. So, and at least, okay, well, we may, of course, there's a lot more to be said about those things, and we should continue. I'll shut up because I know that we're maybe running out of time now.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, thank you for the questions. I invite Professor Dattesh Parulekar from School of International and Area Studies, Goa University, to deliver his presentation on the role of AI diplomacy in pursuance of governance solutions in the Global South, the Indian perspective. Professor, will you share any material?
No, I will be speaking extempore.
Okay, no problem. So, like the previous speakers, you have 45 minutes for your talk, and I would like to know when there are 5 minutes remaining, okay? Have a great presentation, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Am I audible? Yes, thank you. At the outset, let me thank Professor Naitamar for inviting me to this very prestigious colloquium. And I'm indeed privileged to be able to place my thoughts here. As I call it, the role of AI diplomacy in finding solutions for the Global South. Now, before we get into the details of it, let me outline what I believe are 4 fundamental characteristics of the world order as it's emerging in recent times. The first is there is a fundamental fault line which is developing between democracies and non-democracies. And this is important to consider. We may either call them democracies and autocracies, or we may even, for that matter, call them democracies and democracies. And the debate really is, are you democracy in form or are you democracy in performance? And we need to keep this duality in mind, because when we discuss AI, both in terms of its conception and also in terms of its deployment, this democracies versus non-democracies argument is going to be fundamentally important. The second is what I call as the dichotomy of exceptionalisms. There are 2 exceptionalism models that are at work today in the world order. One which has been around now for 7 decades, which is the Western-centric US-driven model that presents one kind of an exceptionalism to the world. And there is a significant pushback from China, which is also presenting its own exceptionalism. Now, the problem in these 2 exceptionalisms is these 2 exceptionalisms lines don't meet. They are parallel lines that are seeming to create exclusivist world orders or exclusivist world visions. And this again must be kept in mind when we are discussing AI, because obviously you will have one kind of AI and another kind of AI. The way we are discussing the internet today, and there are many who are saying, will there be a Western internet and will there be a Chinese internet? The third aspect of the global order that we must keep in mind is there is the rise of neither of these two, but there is the rise of what we call as entrepreneurial powers. And this is where India probably can be situated in what I call as the power of entrepreneurship. We are an entrepreneurial power that is looking to bridge these two exceptionalisms in various ways, including in the technological space. And I will come to that a little later. The fourth and the last feature, what I see going forward, is that there are going to be two important variables that are going to be very important from the point of view of AI and technological innovation and development. One, of course, is the phenomenon of technology itself and how it permeates every sphere of human development. But matched along with technology, we have the consideration of sustainability. So what we are calling it today is a world of technology and a world of sustainability. And negotiating the terms of these two, that is the level of technology and how it breeds sustainability, is going to be critical for the global South in terms of how it negotiates AI. So keeping all of these four features in mind, let's now get into the discussion about how I see the whole development of artificial intelligence and India's perspective on all of this. Let's just begin right now by understanding the landscape. As we speak, the G7 has announced next week, there's going to be the first meeting of the technical working group on the intergovernmental forum of the G7 countries to discuss regulatory frameworks of called as the ethical AI framework. Now, the problem in all of this is that it's the G7 framework or it's the OECD framework. It seems to perpetuate what we have always known about technology, which is that its geographical concentration is in the global north and not the global south. And to the extent that these kind of discussions will happen only within small collectives in the global north, it's not going to serve either the purpose of the global south, nor is it going to serve the purpose of trying to unite in consensus on what kind of AI we need. If that be so, let's understand why the importance of ethics in international relations AI comes in. Because unlike many other spheres of consideration of the ethics of AI, when you're looking at AI in terms of diplomacy, there are three aspects to it. One is AI helps you to leverage diplomacy, because AI tools are increasingly transforming the way diplomacy is done, not only in terms of how it's done procedurally, but also how it's done substantially. But technology and AI is also redefining the geopolitics of diplomacy. The geopolitical landscape is being redefined by who controls AI, because AI is becoming the greatest source of power projection. And we know that countries in the global north, who of course have the financial resources and the technological infrastructure, are in a much better position compared to the global south to be able to bring about an impact on politics, on the economy, and of course on society as well. However, when we discuss the whole idea, there is another third element to it, and which is how is AI shaping the environment in which diplomacy is to be conducted? And that is exactly the point where I come to how ethics of IR cannot be limited to international relations alone. When we try to develop a certain ethical framework of artificial intelligence, where we are trying to accommodate the views of the global north and the global south, it can't be done in a pure sense, because ethics, when they are negotiated in a political space, is not pure. It always has to be negotiated in a manner in which it connects with other disciplines. And for international relations, it will connect with political decision-making, it will connect with the logic of economic commerce, and it will also connect with the logic of lawmaking and lawfare. So having said that, where does India step in here? The Indian view of global governance, including in terms of the technological space, is driven by India's vision of what it calls as Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is the entire universe is one family. And the whole idea that India has taken in trying to bridge the Western perspective and the Chinese perspective on various issues is to talk in terms of accommodation, to talk in terms of consensus, and to be able to build certain common principles. So what are those principles on which India is pushing for an AI for the global South? In 2018, the policy think tank of the government of India, which is called the Niti Aayog, came out with a national strategy for artificial intelligence in 2018. That has laid out 7 principles. The first principle is safety and reliability. And this is important because if we are developing artificial intelligence, then artificial intelligence must have the innate integrity to it. It must be of a higher order. It must have a certain value quotient that is laden within it. And that will make it credible and reliable. The second is equality. And this is important because we've seen that in the development of AI, equality is also a big factor because ultimately AI is a creation of the content creator. So are we essentially creating AI tools which are only going to perpetuate the biases and the prejudices that exist within human beings? And if that becomes so, what happens to the global South? So the whole idea of equality is to be able to take out the ability for biases and conformities to come in. The third is inclusivity. And here I come to the point, if there has to be an AI framework that develops for global diplomacy, there must be a dialogue between the global North and the global South. It cannot be simply the global North deciding certain rules and then trying to lay those rules out for others to follow. And so inclusivity and non-discrimination. And I come to non-discrimination because in many of the global regimes that have been created over the years, discrimination has been at the heart of it. If you look at the nuclear debate, the whole idea of nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament collapsed even before it began, was because it sought to create a world of nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots. And India stands very clearly for the principle that there cannot be a world of AI haves and AI have-nots. So there is no discrimination out here. The whole idea of privacy and security. And this is something very important because India stands for something that the global South very much talks about, which is data localization. It's very important for data protection to happen because data mining puts those people whose data is out there to be on the front of vulnerability. And so data privacy and data security is a key underpinning to a potential AI framework. Apart from that, the idea of transparency, and this is very important because as AI tools are getting developed, we need transparency not only in terms of their creation, but we need transparency in terms of how they are regulated and also how they are leveraged and deployed. And this is very important. The seventh is accountability. So there is very clear need to be able to hold people and stakeholders accountable, because otherwise, if there is no accountability, then it can run riot and become an uncontrolled monster. And the last point is protection and reinforcement of positive human values. And this is important. We are not just talking human values here, because creativity is also a human value. But we know that along with the idea of creativity and innovation, there must be a positive streak to it. So if that creativity and innovation is positive, it's moving society in terms of its upliftment to a higher order, then that is something that is AI which must be promoted, and that is AI which must be developed. So protection and reinforcement of positive human values. So these are the 7 principles on which India's perspective has been staked out. And in the recent meeting that happened of the Global South, India, of course, right now is the chair of the G20. In that capacity, India hosted a meeting of the Global South. And many of these principles were embraced by most countries of the Global South who felt that this would be definitely a consensual framework if these principles are brought into the picture. Now, when we look at artificial intelligence also comes to the core of what really is the ethical framework like. We all know that UNESCO got together some time back and all 193 countries came together and agreed on a kind of an ethical code or an ethical guideline, which would drive the AI development. But we know that while technology is a great leveler, technology also is a strategic disruptor. And technology at the same time can also be one that can distort the landscape. So how do we build an ethical framework that, of course, takes into account the leveling of the level playing field of technology, that also looks at technology as a very important strategic disruptor that takes away the status quo? And we see that many of the problems in the global south are because of status quo. They need strategic disruption to be able to move themselves to a higher plane of operation. But you also need to have technology that doesn't distort the landscape. And this is important because if distortion happens, then it takes away from the uniqueness and the positive human values that AI seeks to bring. India's national strategy for AI has put together 5 sectors where AI would have the greatest impact in the global south. The first is, of course, healthcare. And this is something that must be discussed, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, because we are now seeing that not only do you need elementary healthcare, you also need healthcare at various levels. So you need radiology, you need diagnostics, you need vaccines, and you need a lot of AI involvement is going to be there in terms of the health infrastructure that is going to develop in the global south. So healthcare becomes a very important focus area where AI diplomacy becomes very, very key. And here again, there is a need for the global north and the global south to work, because finance, tech, and your ecosystems of human innovation have to come together. The second is the field of agriculture. And again, this is extremely important because AI diplomacy trying to find solutions for agriculture becomes important for the simple reason that agriculture is a great employment generator. Agriculture creates a lot of productivity. And just take the example of Africa, for instance, which has almost 60% of the arable land of the world, but doesn't even produce 10% of global agricultural produce. So if you want to move a continent like Africa up the value chain in terms of agriculture, you obviously need development of artificial intelligence. But that artificial intelligence must take into account, again, those 3 principles of leveling the playing field, of disrupting, and yet ensuring that it does not distort the landscape. The third area is smart cities and infrastructure. And this is, again, very important because AI essentially looks to move the stakeholder ecosystem into a smart universe. And therefore, the smart city development needs a lot of work in terms of AI development. Again, here it's important because the manner in which AI gets deployed and the tools are being developed, those tools need to be developed by keeping in mind the requirements of the global south. And to the extent that these tools will develop in the global north, they will probably be detached from the realities. They have to be grassroots initiatives. And that's why the focus on trying to bring about skill-based innovation across local communities in the global south. Technology and technology development must be rooted in these communities and must not essentially be superimposed. It's also important to look at the idea of mobility and transportation, because this becomes an extremely important aspect. And when we are looking at mobility and transportation, again, you're looking at the ethics because you obviously want transportation to be broad-based. You want it to be inclusive, but at the same time, you also want it to be one that does not create debt upon debt. And the last aspect is education. Now, all of these 5 principles are something that have been put forward through the idea of what is called as public goods. We all understand the concept of public goods, where you have certain countries and certain entities that provide public goods, but you provide these goods in the notion that these goods don't belong to you. You provide these goods for public welfare. Now, India has moved with a call during the G20 presidency, and this is something that the global south again embraces, is the idea to make technology, particularly digital technology, a public good. So if you make digital technology public goods, you're essentially talking about technology becoming public infrastructure. And when it becomes public infrastructure, there is agency and ownership of the community, and it does not remain simply a superimposed commercial obligation. So it's very important to look at this aspect and to see how this can be taken forward. But then we also have to talk about the human rights aspect of artificial intelligence. And this is particularly important because societies in the global south have traditionally found themselves vulnerable in the hands of the global north, as certain production structures, certain financial transmissions have taken place from the global north to the global south. And therefore, there is an important idea here that can artificial intelligence essentially explain itself? Which is to say that artificial intelligence which is created must have a human rights component in the sense it must reflect some of the flaws that exist within human beings. If you're trying to create an absolutely perfect AI, it actually is an imperfect AI. And AI must be able to show up some of the qualities that human beings have. So when we do decision-making, that decision-making is driven by a certain mental rationalization. It is driven by a certain cognitive understanding. It is driven by a certain deliberation that happens in the mind. And it's also driven by value judgments. Can AI diplomacy inhabit all this? Will it have the value judgments? Will it have the ability to be able to be like how humans are? And that's why the idea of AI explaining itself is very important. The ethical AI concept that was essentially drafted by the OECD in 2019, of course, there were other countries as well who joined it outside of the OECD. That was something that India, on behalf of the global south, felt was inadequate. And there were 4 reasons why it was felt to be inadequate. And this is again where it comes to the heart of AI diplomacy. So what are the problems with the ethical AI concept drafted by the OECD and sought to be made global? The first is there is no obligation on the part of the content creator towards the end user. Ultimately, AI is about the end user. And India has taken a position that India's ethical AI framework is all about preventing or protecting user harm. The whole concept of user harm has to be protected. Now, the content creator has no moral or financial obligation towards the end user. The content creator of AI is, in a sense, only obligated to the person who assigns him the task or her the task of creating the AI in the first place. So it's a detachment from the end user harm principle, and therefore it does not really suffice. The second is, unlike various areas of professional expertise where you have a certain ethical code, like for example in medicine, you have an ethical code that you have to follow. Because this ethical code has been created over decades and centuries. Because of the newness of AI, there is no real historical precedent or historical antecedents as to what constitutes norms of good behavior. And we must understand that ultimately, if you have to find good AI diplomacy as a solution to global south problems, it starts with norm building. So how do you even start the process of norm building when you don't have enough of a historical record as to what constitutes good behavior when it comes to technology? So in the absence of that, how do you define good AI and not good AI? The third aspect is what we always have a problem with, that many of these frameworks are very high on principle, but these principles are vaguely and ambiguously mentioned. So you see many of the ways in which the AI framework is developed in terms of policymaking circles, it's not crisp, it's not specific, it doesn't go to the point. It seems to be largely a case where you're allowing everyone the space to find their own space. So the whole idea of no workable methods to transform principles into practice. You can have a statement of good principles, but ultimately, how do you transform that into a compact of policy practice? And that is something that is lacking within ethical AI. And the fourth one is there is no stringent legal or regulatory framework that establishes transparency and accountability. And unless you have transparency and accountability, this AI diplomacy becomes nothing but another way of power projection. We must understand when it comes to AI, because this is an absolutely new domain, and it's something where, the whole idea of integrity comes in very hard. When we look at power and how an AI is power in the hands of who generates AI. What is power? We have always known that the whole Western understanding of power has been about essentially influence through might is right. But the Indian view of power, and this is throughout India's civilizational spread, has always been about power with righteousness. It is about dharma, and dharma here is not religion. Dharma here is doing the right thing. So Indian civilization has always talked about you should be successful, but even more important is you should be good. So successful is important, but being good is even more important. You must be victorious, that is good, but you must be virtuous. So the virtuousness is more important than the victoriousness. Being good is more important than being successful. And that is how you bring righteousness into an understanding of power. Now, if that be so, how do you bring this into the AI governance space? So India has talked about human-centric governance and human-centric globalization. And this is where I want to go back to the two exceptionalisms that I was talking about in the very beginning, the Western exceptionalism and the very powerful Chinese exceptionalism. According to India, the Western exceptionalism is nothing but euphemism for corporatism, where AI is essentially going to be a tool in the hands of the corporates for profit maximization, for control, for power projection, and for essentially bringing economics in different ways. So you have a corporatist exceptional model that is driven from the West. In contrast, the Chinese exceptional model, which is making rapid inroads, is also a statist or a state corporation driven model of exceptionalism. And again, that is sometimes dangerous, because obviously then AI becomes nothing but a tool in the hands of a government to be able to institute all methods of power projection, right, wrong, ugly, whatever it may be. And so India has said that instead of having a AI-centric world to find solutions to global problems in the global South, it must be a human-centric appreciation of AI, where AI is at the disposal of human solutions, where human emancipation is at the center of all actions. And that's why the whole idea that India has put forward, which is human-centric globalization, where what is more important is not the individual good. What is not important is the good of a group of countries, but what is important is the wider collective good. And in fact, the wider collective good is particularly important now because you see that there is no real dialogue between the global North and the global South in terms of being able to create an acceptable or a consensual AI model. It seems to be that everyone is talking in small collectives and nobody is talking to each other. And you see this very much in the whole debate over technology itself. We are seeing Western technology and we are seeing Chinese technology, and both are not talking to each other. If both don't talk to each other, we actually see the world going down the path of two internets. And just as we see the world going down the path of two internets, are we also going to see the world go down the path of maybe two AIs or multiple AIs? And if that happens, you are not leading the world to find solutions. You're actually fragmenting the world when technology is meant to unite the world. So you're actually reversing the laws of nature and what technology wants you to do. Recently, India's foreign minister, when he was speaking in the European Union in a meeting on the Trade Council, made a very important point. And he said India's view on technology and trade is driven by trusted collaboration for re-globalization. See, what we are seeing today is globalization is now being shaped by new forces. The old globalization was the colonial perpetuated globalization. that we saw in the early 90s and the early 2000s. What you are now seeing is the rise of the global South, where the global South wants a seat at the high table and wants to essentially negotiate the terms on which global governance is driven. It's no longer about solidarity. It's now about empowerment. And if that be the case, new forces of globalization are driven by resources. They are driven by value chains and supply chains. They are driven by locational attributes. They are driven by your ability to bring connectivity. They are also driven by your ability to bring integrity and credibility to your initiatives. These are the new forces that are shaping globalization. And that is why trusted collaboration for reglobalization is the mantra that must underpin AI and an AI framework. It may be ethical, it may be unethical from the point of view of what the OECD has said, but it obviously is going to be important because you are putting trust, and public trust is very important. It's also important to understand that AI is so important for the global South because it is seen as one of the mediums to be able to remove inequalities and inefficiencies, to be able to increase output, increase productivity, provide a level playing field, being able to bring in those sectors who are feeling marginalized. But if AI is not done properly, if the diplomacy on AI continues to be a perpetuation of the North to the South, then the very inequalities and equities that we are seeking to address will actually get fueled and they will get reinforced and intensified. So it's very important to understand that these issues need to be dealt with. I will just take a last couple of points and then I will probably stop and maybe take a few questions. The Indian view of technology has always been about one, where technology must have accessibility, must have affordability, and must have inclusivity. In fact, right now, India has done a lot of work in terms of technological innovation here at home. In fact, in this G20 presidency year, India is showcasing and prioritizing the showcase of what is called as the tech stack, which is basically bringing technological interventions for basic governance solutions. So for example, financial inclusion. Now, financial inclusion is essentially about bringing those people who are outside the banking network into the formal banking network. Now, when you do something like financial inclusion, if that particular model of technology does not have the credibility, does not have the trust quotient, does not have the integrity, then probably it is not going to be a public good in the real sense of the term. Similarly, it's important to also bring about the financial interface and the payment system, which is so very important to be able to allow people to use digital mediums for payment interaction. Now, through all of this, what India has said is that this must become affordable, this must be accessible. And there has been a lot of opposition that has come from certain countries within the G20 framework. And this is very similar to what's happening with the AI as well. There is a pushback against actually allowing accessibility of knowledge. I see this very much in what happened with vaccines as well. At a time when India, South Africa, China, Brazil, there were countries in the global South who came forward and said that this was a time to take out the power of patents, to liberate vaccines from patents, and to essentially allow vaccine accessibility to the whole world. And we've seen that despite the best efforts, that has not really come to fruition. And that's because countries which are driven by a certain corporatist model will not want to essentially cede knowledge. But that is where you come to this whole idea. Can you be enlightened and broad-minded, or are you trying to be enlightened and looking for enlightened solutions, but you're being narrow-minded? Because you can't really be able to develop AI diplomacy if you're going to approach AI diplomacy from simply a patron-client relationship. For far too long, the relationship in technology has been patron-client, where there is a patron in the North and the South is the client. But there is a need to move away from patron-client relationship to co-development, to co-production, where there is a stakeholder-centric approach where the creator and the user are commonly, bound together in a stakeholder-centric approach. Lastly, I would conclude by saying that AI diplomacy has tremendous potential, because AI has tremendous potential for upliftment of the global South, to find solutions which are enduring and sustainable for the global South. But for that to happen, we must look at AI tools not only through the prism of emancipation, we must look at them from the lens of empowerment. They must be essentially empowering tools and not just emancipating tools. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Now I open the session for questions, which can be submitted through the chat or here. And I will follow the chat again. Professor Nitamar, you can go, please.
Thank you so much, Dattesh. It was very nice to hear you again. This was indeed a very empowering talk, extremely interesting and relevant, especially the way you so well spoke of this challenge of recasting the role of the global South vis-a-vis this northern hemisphere, especially when it comes to computer technologies, and especially now artificial intelligence, as we realize that most conversations and discussions are still taking place in a North Atlantic environment. So it's very important that India is assuming this very important protagonism, as we'd like to do with all the other BRICS countries. We are very grateful, Dattesh, that you are contributing to this collective endeavor in which you have also our Russian, Chinese, South African, and Brazilian colleagues trying to come together and have an open dialogue with the US, European Union, and North Atlantic colleagues as well. So that's the idea, to keep the conversation going, as opposed to simply importing European and North Atlantic ideas and models for AI governance. So my question to you is very simple, especially given your fantastic India background. Since in India we have such a pluralism of a different religious and moral worldviews, I'd like to see what you'd say about precisely bringing together such a pluralism without conflicts. Because, of course, when you're talking about values, as you rightly pointed out, you may have a disagreement, right? When we ask our Chinese, Russian, South African, Indian, and Brazilian colleagues, not to mention American and European colleagues, they might have different proposals in terms of what's the best way to go in when we talk about AI governance. So my question to you is precisely, how do you deal with a pluralism, even when you invoke democracy, as you did in the very beginning of your conversation? As you know, we cannot take for granted that everyone has the same view of democratic values or freedom, equality, and so forth. So I'd just like to hear you from your Indian experience. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Nitamar. I think you asked a very, very important question. And this goes to the heart of India's pluralism being a strength of India, but India's civilizational, antecedents, the fact that India goes back, in terms of its civilizational understanding, thousands of years back into ancient times, is also a strength for India to be able to bring this pluralism and create a strength. Now, in the field of technology, this is always challenged. So any amount of diversity is going to be threatened by technology, because technology can unite, but technology can also be used to divide. and very powerfully divide. And so the idea, and that's why I stressed at the very end of my talk on certain value systems, which are not just value systems of India's political existence, but they are value systems that are drawn from India's civilizational discourse. So when I talked about the idea of not just power, but righteousness, that righteousness goes back to a civilizational understanding that when you have the power to change people's lives, when you have the power to do something, you do things positively and you do things by keeping in mind the collective good. So when you shape responses, approaches within a pluralistic society, you don't do them on the basis of the lowest common denominator, which is what normally people do. You actually do them by going for the highest possible threshold in terms of what a denominator is. And if you look at most of India's technological solutions, they're actually the most secular, because technology can also give you the power to be absolutely secular. It can cut across all differences. In India, you have a lot of fundamental problems, economic, societal, political. But when you bring in technological solutions by keeping human-centric, stakeholder-centric approach in mind, they cut across all this diversity and they unite. So when you bring in, so in India, the kind of technological changes that have happened have impacted everybody universally. That is why the Indian approach is what is called as universalism and not exceptionalism. When we say exceptionalism, it's good, but it seeks to create a certain exclusivity. When you say universalism, you are bringing all exceptionalisms together into a melting pot and trying to create a syncretic universal idea. So the Indian way to look at pluralism and to approach it from the AI concept is to root it in India's civilizational discourse, is to root it in India's understanding of universalism, and to root it and anchor it in India's understanding of the collective good, which is much larger than the good of any one particular community within India.
I'm sorry. Professor Xudong, you can be the next, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Parulekar. Sorry for the pronunciation if not correct. And the question I'm going to ask, first, I'm very happy to hear your talk because that's exactly the part I'm very concerned about of the development of artificial intelligence, the political and ethical dimension, but I didn't mention it in my own presentation. And I agree with you basically about the idea of the emancipation and the concern about the emancipation of human being by the artificial intelligence instead of controlled by it or controlled by the power. But there are, in fact, for me, you have mentioned, in fact, two pair of concepts which is embedded in the structure of the power structure. Because if we take, as you mentioned, artificial intelligence, a new emergent power, and how who the power belongs to, and how should we deal with this new power. And you mentioned the antagonism, or even or just the competition between countries, or antagonism between the North and the global South. And you also mentioned at another level the antagonism between the government and the people. But there is, as far as I was educated in Paris, and there is always a very strong leftist tradition and a Marxist tradition. What is lack, as far as I see it, in your talk, is a very Marxist perspective, because there is also an essential question of the class antagonism. Because it's also it's not only about the government and the people, it's more about, in fact, the capital and the working class, or the people who are under the control of the capital. Because in fact, in reality, we can already observe that the AI now, at least in the present time, is not first of all controlled by any government. Of course, there are government very powerful and wants to have a grasp of it, but it's above all, some companies, some enterprise who are in control of the artificial intelligence. And in this case, they are also using this, or they could use it in the future as a new way to how to say to reinforce their way to exploiting people working class. So how do you take this perspective? Or I'm not sure if you are a Marxist or not, but it's just a different way to see the stuff. Thank you.
No, so yeah, so I'll firstly clarify that it's not. I'm far away from Marxist as anyone can be, but that was not a Marxist kind of an apologist argument, but it was an argument that, as you rightly said, what we are having is a new elite that is emerging, and this elite is a new constituency of content creators of AI, and they are becoming so powerful that probably they will be in cahoots with governments in the advanced north to create the rules of the game. See, it's very important to understand there are rules of the game and there are rules of the road. Rules of the game are subject to change because as the game changes, the game turns, the rules also change. But the rules of the road cannot change in respect to the rules of the game. So what I was making the argument was that if you allow big businesses and the advanced north to shape the rules without any dialogue with the global south, what you're effectively doing is perpetuating old orders. You might be emancipating, but you are not empowering. And I say this because there is a lot of example in the global south where cost-effective solutions with regard to AI are emerging, but they are emerging in very small locales and small pockets. They are not in a position to leverage them. Technology, invention is one thing, but the commercialization of technology is what makes technology, relevant. So in terms of being able to commercialize technology, you have the advanced north with the power of finance, the power of their tech ecosystem, the power of, in fact, communication. And we have not talked much about communication because AI helps communication, but AI also needs to be communicated. So it is the power of information, it's the power of finance, it's power of tech that comes from the global north, which doesn't allow countries in the global south to give vent to their own aspirations. So you'll have an AI model for African agriculture, which will come from somewhere in the United States, the prairie belt, which may not sufficiently be conversant with what is needed for Africa. And I say this because India in the AI space has emerged as a country with nascent solution, but cost-effective solutions. In many places, India is able to make inroads because India is able to provide value and quality, but also with cost effectiveness. And that is called the empowerment. So as I said, it is not about the emancipation, which is how the North always saw it, that we have to emancipate people in the South. It is about empowerment. And when you empower, you're actually giving power to those people who are the ultimate stakeholders of that particular AI instrument. It should be an instrument of change, but it should come from those whose destiny is to be changed itself.
Professor Otávio, please.
Thank you so much, Dattesh, for this very rich and interesting talk. I like the overall idea of using technology to bring societies together. And that, of course, it's ideal. The issue is, especially in the case of AI, since a lot of it is developed by companies who have their own interests, their own stakes, who are interested in dominating portions of the market in their own way. How do you see the two pictures hanging together, right? Those companies will tend to fight, what's the expression? Fight handed new and tails. Well, whatever.
Tooth and nail.
So yes, toes and nails to get dominance, right? And that will go against the idea of just bringing together. It was actually very interesting when Google came in many years ago. We came in with a message, well, do no harm, we're going to do good things and so on. And of course, we know where it ended, right? With all kinds of breach of information and using data from users and so on. So it's complicated. So I'd like to hear,
No, absolutely. In fact, my pitch was really that we must not go down that path again. The same path that was created in the case of the World Wide Web and the internet, where the power of, for example, the e-commerce platforms, they become so big that they're almost, transcending sovereign jurisdictions, and they're operating in a jurisdiction of their own. You don't want a situation where the small cozy club of AI content creators and exponents, they become a kind of an elitist universe of themselves, and they begin to negotiate. And that is why the Indian approach, in fact, India is coming up with its own digital act very soon, and which is going to also include AI. India has made it very clear that our guardrails that we are going to put for India is going to be end user harm. So if there are things that are involved which is bringing harm to the end user, then the government is going to be very strict on that. Now, your argument that how would you be able to essentially, tame some of these elements? I think we must bear in mind that, as I said some time back, you can create technology, but you need to commercialize it. And today there is a saturation point in the global north with regard to permeating and spreading technology. Technology has to be leveraged in the global south. And the power of the global south today is in terms of captive markets. So while there is content creation in the global north, they will need to obviously work together with forces in the global south, so long as the global south is able to stand up for its own principles. In fact, right now, the G77, in fact, India has talked about the G7, the G20, and the G77, all three getting together and working together on a common framework. So you effectively create all governments at the same level to be able to take on big business. But the whole idea is the power of the global south is because that's where the markets are, that's where the captive potential is, that's where technology could be leveraged, and that is where you'll be able to set new rules and be able to at least contest with some of these big businesses and not have to face the same problems that you face with the internet.
Now, I hope you're right on this. Just that thinking about the situation in the US, for example, there's no way they are able to regulate things effectively. And even though just last few days, there is a new commission in the Senate to try to get some guidelines on this, but historically, there is a lot of resistance in the US towards regulating markets, and there you have, Google, Microsoft, Apple, they will resist, fiercely any kind of, and there will be lobbying in the Senate so that those things never actually happen, right? So, but it will be good. I agree with you. It'd be nice.
So I guess the more viable model is what we call as the public-private partnership. And that's something India has made it very clear as well, that we don't allow big businesses to simply come in here. And in fact, India has stood very strongly on data localization. And India has not allowed data to be taken back to the United States. We've said, look, data privacy is very important for us, and we are willing to take hard measures, even if it means that there will be some pain to our community. So the whole idea is that we can't go in with a simply corporatist approach, where it's private sector which is controlling all content. We can't also be steeped in an old statist approach, where the state-driven methods of putting state corporations ahead. You need a balance in the two, and that's where the public-private partnership model is something, I think, where there's a stakeholding for the private sector. There are also profits are taken into account, but at the same time, the state comes in as a potential filter and a potential guardrail for society.
Thank you.
Sure, pleasure.
Any more questions? No?
Well, excuse me, Camila, if no one else has a question, I'd just like to raise another quick question to Dattesh. Professor Parulekar, I'd just like to know what you make of the fact that this is a typical global southern problem, or a problem that of course, we see in many other countries, but particularly in the global south, the so-called brain drain problem. There you have so many brilliant Indian, Chinese, Russian, Brazilian, South African researchers. They end up going to Europe, or especially to the United States, to conduct research because they can have a very good infrastructure, money for this research. They get good funding for this, as Otávio was pointing out. You go to big companies, and therefore, for some reason, in several of these countries, we end up, losing the possibility of developing more of research in this very domain, especially in new technologies and AI. So I'd just like to see how would you respond to this. Of course, we know that India has some interesting public policies in terms of retaining researchers and investing in infrastructure and technology, innovation, etc. But just like to see how would you respond to this challenge of the brain drain phenomena. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously at a fundamental level, it's a structural problem that will take some time to resolve, because we are coming out of a situation where you have an aspirational society, and knowledge is power, but knowledge is also capable of being monetized today. But I would say that first of all, there are different experiences. First of all, in India itself, you have the IITs and the IITs, which are Indian Institute of Technology, which are quite prestigious institutes that are now becoming extremely good, not only in terms of providing education and instruction, but having a very vibrant interface with industry. So what we need in the global south is more industry-academia interface, because most often it's not just the money, but it's the fact there's a lack of opportunity to that young person, that brilliant person who wants to do something but really gets frustrated by the system, and that system drives him out. If he can see that there is academia, industry interface, I don't think that's the case that will happen all the time, because today AI allows you actually to be not just a content creator, but a value creator. Unlike in the past where you had to go and create value in some other area, today, if you can actually get the basic ingredients in place in your own country, you don't just become a content creator or a progenitor of technology, you also become a wealth creator. So you create wealth for yourself. And I would say it's a very good development where the BRICS countries have come together and have now also put together a BRICS Innovation Fund. And in fact, they're also going to be picking some of the best minds amongst the BRICS countries, providing them scholarship. And this fellowship, the BRICS fellowship that is being provided for research and development, science and technology, is not to do something esoteric, something abstract and mysterious. It's actually to find solutions to problems in BRICS countries. So the problem-solving nature is also being brought into the equation. So yes, it is a structural problem. Brain drain will continue to happen for maybe a few decades to come, but that shift has begun to happen. And as more and more money goes into research and development and science and technology systems, people will look to come back and create wealth in their own countries, particularly when there are opportunities of academia-industry interface. So it has to work at various levels for it to actually bring about a paradigm shift.
That's it. Okay, so I would like to thank everyone for the insightful discussions, particularly the Professor Zhao Fan, Professor Xudong Zheng, and Professor Dattesh Parulekar for sharing their research with us. I hereby declare this panel closed and invite you all to join us again at 2 p.m. Brazil time for more discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Salut. Thank you. Au revoir. Thank you.